One of today's readings is from Psalm 16. When I read this psalm, I find my soul dancing with divergent reactions and interpretations. One reaction says, the writer seems to want God to administer a vaccination that would protect the writer from any troubles or suffering in life. The psalmist calls out to God, "Protect me, O God, for in you I take refuge." The psalmist says to God, those people who choose other gods, not you, who get their faith vaccination from some other deity, not only experience sorrows, their sorrows multiply. Their choice to worship other gods nets them even more problems in life. But I'm not like those people, says the psalmist. I'm a person who admires the holy people, the pious people who trust in you, God. You, my God, are my cup. I feed from you. My life depends on you. The psalmist says this loyalty to God has led to a good life. The psalmist writes, the boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. As if the psalmist says, I draw a line in the ground between myself and those who worship other gods, and on my side of the line, life is pleasant. The psalmist apparently feels safe, courageous, secure. When I read this psalm, I think whoever this psalmist was, he or she was having a pretty good day when he or she wrote those words. Maybe he or she was having and had to that point a very good life. And as my internal discussion of this psalm begins, I discover part of me wanting to say amen to the psalmist's trust in God. Trust that nothing removes us from God's care, God's love. To say amen to the idea that the good in us, the best in us, derives from God, that God has created us as expressions and extensions of God's sacredness, of God's love, that focusing our attention, our lives on God will lead us to not only feeling blessed by God, but lead us to ourselves being a blessing to others, being people who offer healing, who give hope, who affirm worth, who welcome others home to the heart of the Creator. I say amen to experiences of joy and discerning a way of life, a path of life that is grounded in being a part of one amazing, wondrous creation, that is grounded in a sense of my spirit awakening and constantly being reborn and birthing new life, of discovering that my capacity to love is expanding and deepening, that I am more able now than I was yesterday to somehow see the image of God in others, to feel compassion for others, to embrace nonviolence as a path of life, to be an expression of God's life-giving presence. So I read Psalm 16 and I hear the psalmist's faith in God's presence, in God's spirit, active in his or her life, shaping the writer into a person of courageous love and faith. And I say amen to all of that. But as I read the psalm, the other opinion in my internal dialogue says God doesn't vaccinate us against or protect us from experiencing any troubles in life. Other psalms often begin different than this psalm. They begin by saying, where are you, God, when I need you? Or saying, I'm surrounded by enemies, God. People mock me and make fun of me, God. And the psalms that begin in those ways usually then go on to say, but nevertheless, you are my God. And I trust in your faithful love and presence. But it seems to me the writer of Psalm 16 not only asks, but seems to expect that because the writer has faith in God, God not only can, but God indeed does protect the writer and fill the writer's life with good things and gives the writer a good life. And that's why I read the psalm with divergent reactions. The writer is writing from his or her own experience, from a life of devotion to God, a life that seems safe and secure. And I believe that on all of our parts, it's an attitude of blessing to hear others' experiences and to somehow affirm those experiences. But I also think that one person's experience does not become the standard for evaluating everyone's experiences. If you're reading Psalm 16 from a different place in life, then it can be difficult. You may experience it, be reading it when you're experiencing crisis in life. Or you may be reading it when you find yourself on the other side of that boundary line, the side where life definitely is not pleasant. And if so, then this psalm can sound like an indictment of your faith. As if the psalm says to you, if you just took refuge in God, your life would be good. You would rest secure. Life would be full of joy. That isn't everyone's experience. And most of us know this. Most of us know we journey through life straddling that psalmist boundary line between the pleasant and the unpleasant. We experience times of joy and laughter. We celebrate accomplishments, milestones. We have aha moments walking along a river. We experience joy playing peekaboo with an infant in the grocery cart of the person just ahead of us at the grocery store checkout counter. We have times where life seems filled with life and with joy. But we also experience times of grief. Grief as we sit with someone who's dying. Grief as we visit a parent whose dementia means they can no longer speak our name. Grief as the company downsizing means that after 15 years of working, we suddenly find ourselves unemployed. Grief as we read of wars and rumors of wars. Jesus sometimes quoted Psalms. This is not one that he quoted, but he does quote Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Quotes it as he suffers crucifixion on the cross of the Roman Empire. When I read the gospel accounts of Jesus, my impression is that Jesus did not so much spend time contemplating a God who kept him safe and secure. Rather, Jesus spent time discerning how God's love could be expressed in and through Jesus' actions, discerning how he could be a source of healing in people's lives, how he could give hope and lessen suffering for others, how in his presence, others could somehow experience God's presence. The passage we read today in Mark's gospel offers, I think, an insight into Jesus' understanding of God and Jesus' understanding of his own role, participating in whatever it was that God was up to at that moment and that place in history. In Mark's gospel, Jesus and his disciples have been to Jerusalem and they've seen the temple in Jerusalem, and that temple was one of the wonders of that ancient world. The temple was massive. It encompassed 2,700 square feet. The entire Temple Mount occupied 37 acres. Walls rose 10 stories high. Some of the stones used in construction weighed 500 tons. For people like the disciples who grew up in villages of single room, 2-room houses, the temple must have seemed like an architectural miracle that would last forever. So with eyes wide open, awe in their voices, the disciples staring up at the walls of the temple say to Jesus, "Look, teacher, what large stones, what large buildings." To which Jesus replies, "These are great buildings, great. And these great buildings you see, they won't last. One day, those large stones will tumble and the walls will collapse, and this greatness will become memory." And it happened about 40 years after Jesus and his disciples visited the temple. About the time, give or take a few years, that this gospel, according to Mark, was written, the temple was destroyed. In the year 70, the Roman general Titus arrived to end a revolt against the Roman Empire. Titus and his legions attacked the city of Jerusalem, and by the time the siege was ended, fire had ravaged the temple. Most of the walls had crumbled. Disciples asked Jesus, when would this happen? When would the seemingly impossible happen and the walls tumble? And Jesus responded by telling them that there would be wars and rumors of wars, and nation would rise against nation. There would be earthquakes. Sounds like it could be his time. Sounds like it could be our time. Sounds like any time, every time. Wars, threats of wars, plans for wars, earthquakes, storms, droughts. I think Jesus knew that living as part of, as an expression of God's amazing, wondrous creation meant also living in a world in which both joy and pain were present. Jesus, this one who had discerned at his baptism, God naming him God's beloved, God's child, would eventually die on a cross. And so he spoke to his disciples about God's active creation being ongoing. He described all that we experience in this world being the beginning of the birth pangs, of being not a finished creation, but a creation being born, of God who didn't sit back after 7 days of creation and just admire God's completed creation, but of a God who's still and always in labor, giving birth. So as I read the psalm, as I read Jesus' words, as I read about his life, I think they lead us to a faith that does trust in God's love. Trust that God's love is a love that is still birthing this creation. Birthing creation as a world of peace, as some kind of sacred harmony, leads us to faith that in all our experiences of life, we are somehow experiencing the birthing, creating love of God. Pema Chodron, a Tibetan Buddhist who teaches at the Gampo Abbey in Nova Scotia, speaks of this understanding, I think, this understanding of life, but from the Buddhist tradition. And as you hear her words, remember Jesus' image of no stone being left upon another. Pema Chodron writes, things falling apart is a kind of testing and also a kind of healing. We think that the point is to pass the test or overcome the problem, but the truth is that things don't really get solved. They come together and they fall apart. Then they come together again and they fall apart again. It's just like that. The healing comes from letting there be room for all of this to happen. Room for grief, for relief, for joy. I think we experience life often like waves that rise and fall, that come together and fall apart. The psalmist invites us to let there be room in our lives for God. God who is always with us. God who does not give us up to despair, but shows us a path of life. Jesus invites us to let there be room in our lives for God, God who is giving birth even in the times and places when walls seem to collapse and the world seems pulled apart. God who is with us in all those times and places, and God who invites us to also give birth in this world, to be people of her hope, to give birth to new hope, to give birth to new economic structures, new relationships with this earth, new relationships with all people. God who invites us to trust that the world we inhabit is God's birthing room, in which tombs become wombs, in which Easter follows Friday's grief, and in which a life we call resurrection is still being born. Faith invites us to trust in a God whose love has no boundary line, but encircles and embraces all. A God in whom we live now and forever. God who has created and is still creating. God who assures us that we live in God's world, that we are not alone. Thanks be to God. Amen.